Okay. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning for this historic day. Today we'll be conducting the selection of the 200 semifinalists for the Michigan's first Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission. This is possible after really years of work, started with a groundswell of action by Michiganders across the state, voters who created a voter amendment proposal in 2018 that amended the Constitution to bring the power of districting to the people directly rather than to legislators, and has carried through since then as the Michigan Department of State has implemented the application period. I'm proud to report that as of today, now that all applications have been processed, we have more than 9,000 people in the state of Michigan who submitted a complete and notarized application. It's a phenomenal number. It's 3,000 more people or applications than were submitted in California's inaugural commission. California, of course, has 4 times the population of Michigan. So it's really just a demonstration of how much enthusiasm there is for this process, how much support there is for this process among the voters of Michigan. We have all 83 counties represented in our applicant pool. The applicant pool is quite diverse, definitely a good reflection of the diversity of the state of Michigan. All 83 counties covers, all the regions of the state. And so we're really excited to have so many people from so many walks of life excited to participate in this process. Today, the selection will draw 200 semifinalists. It is a random selection, and with me today is Stephen Land from Riemann LLC. Stephen will talk through in more detail how exactly that random process works in order to draw a selection of 200 people that is randomly drawn but still reflects the diversity and the requirements laid out in the Constitution. So specifically those 200 people, 100 of them will be from the random mailing that we conducted. There were 250,000 applications that were mailed out randomly to voters across the state. And so half of those 200 will be people who applied that way. And then the other the other of 2 primary requirements is that 60 of the people selected will be people who affiliate with the Democratic Party, 60 will be people who affiliate with the Republican Party, and 80 will be people who affiliate with neither major party. And then in addition, the Constitution requires that the 200 semifinalists as closely as possible mirror the demographics of the state. And so there are criteria built into the way that the application will conduct the selection in order to ensure that's the case as well. That process could take minutes. It could take hours because it's a random process, and the way that it works is the computer will draw 200 people, see if it matches the criteria, and if it doesn't, put them back in and draw again completely. We have no way to predict exactly when it will draw the first draw that actually matches the criteria required by the Constitution. Because we know that could take some time, we will spend that time just answering questions. We'll talk through some of the FAQs on the website. People of the public who are watching are welcome to tweet at Redistricting MI. Tweet questions to us. Members of the media, if you're watching, feel free to shoot a text message to our Media Relations Director, Tracy Wimmer, and we'll get those questions up to Stephen and myself to do our best to talk them through. Once the selection is complete, we will upload the file of the 200 folks who are selected immediately to redistrictingmichigan.org. So as soon as we're done, really, people will be able to go on and see who those 200 people are. so there will be a number of pieces of information in the file that we upload. It will be an Excel file, but then within the next 24 hours, we'll upload the actual applications of each of those 200 people. In the process following that, we will turn over the 200 applications for the semifinalists to the quadrant leaders of our state legislature. They have the month of July to strike up to 5 members. Each of the 4 quadrant leaders can strike up to 5 applications, so up to 20 total. And so then at the end of July, they will return to us 180, give or take, depending on what they choose to do, applications. And we will then conduct the random selection to actually determine who those 13 finalists are. Or rather, I should say, the 13 members of the commission that will then draw the boundaries for the state of Michigan. So again, I'm Jake Rollo, Director of Communications, here with the Michigan Department of State, and I'm going to turn it over to Stephen with Riemann LLC.
All right. Thank you very much. I managed to get this caught on my glasses here. Part of the fun of wearing masks. So what we have developed is a selection tool, an application random selection tool within the framework of Microsoft Excel. The reason that we elected to do this using Excel rather than designing a standalone program is really part of the transparency angle here. This is a program that the state already owns. A lot of people own Microsoft Excel. We're able to share the actual source code in a way that doesn't require any special licensed software. It is a custom program. It does use Visual Basic for Applications programming. We've documented all of that and have been over this throughout the design process. But that's the reason that it looks like a spreadsheet. It was built inside a spreadsheet, but there's a lot of computer coding that's going to be operating here. What you're seeing in front of you now is the application preloaded with some sample data. To stress test the application to make sure it does what we want it to, and also to work on setting the tolerances for random selection and mirroring as closely as possible, as the Constitution says, the demographic makeup of the state. So I'm going to very briefly walk you through how this application selection tool has been created, and we may come back and fill in some more details later while the program is doing its thing. The heart of the spreadsheet is a list of de-identified applications that will be provided. The official list will be provided to me in a few minutes. You can see all I have here is an ID number, which was assigned by the database maintained by the Department of State, and then age, sex, race, ethnicity, and then zip code in order to be able to put people into the appropriate geographic regions, and then party affiliation and whether or not someone received the mailing or applied on their own. From that information, we then take all of that, process it together, and put it into this population sheet, which lists out all of the records. Now, the sample that I'm working off of is a little older. There were about 8,600 records on this last one. We'll see the final count when I load that in a few moments. So the process of randomly selecting 200 records is actually very straightforward. We wouldn't need a fancy program for that. The process of randomly picking 200 records that meet a number of different criteria requires a little more forethought. So I'm going to very briefly run you through what the program does here. The first thing it does is it looks at all of the applications and breaks them down by the various demographic groups. For party affiliation, we split this into Democrats, Republicans, and unaffiliated who did or did not receive that initial random mailing. And we can see the actual number of applications from my earlier test data. We'll refresh this with new data in a few moments. And then the number of actual applications that we ultimately need to select. We won't use any kind of statistical weighting for party because that is specifically prescribed in the Constitution. We will actually select the requisite number from each of those buckets. Then we have a breakdown of applications by gender, The actual number of applications received from males in my test data here exceeded the census statistic. The U.S. Census Bureau has indicated Michigan is 49.2% male and 50.8% female. I suspect we'll see this in the final data as well, but we had more than 49.2% of the applications were male and fewer than 50.8% were female. So in order to give female applications the appropriate potential to be selected in a way that is statistically weighted, we actually apply a weighting factor to each individual application. So if an application is a member of a demographic group that is overrepresented, it will be given less weight to counterbalance that. And if it's a member of a demographic group that's underrepresented, it's given more weight to counterbalance that. And by the time we take the actual applications, apply the weighting factors, and multiply that all out, the weighted percentages, that is the statistical likelihood of each application being selected on the basis of this criteria, are back to matching the census. So the OK that you see here off to the side is actually the Excel program verifying that after weighting is applied, male and female both have the appropriate statistical likelihood of selection. We do the same thing for the race categories. So in the last sample data I was working with, we had certain demographic groups being slightly overrepresented, certain being slightly underrepresented. After we apply the weighting factors, we're back to everything matching the appropriate statistical guidelines there. Same thing is true for Hispanic, which following the U.S. Census Bureau's guidelines is viewed as a separate criteria from race. So we look at race as one and ethnicity as another. And then for age, we have divided the population into 3 bands, which are ages 18 through 34, ages 35 through 54, and ages 55 and up. And you can see, at least with my sample data, the younger age band was underrepresented in actual applications submitted. The older age band was overrepresented. So after the weighting is applied, those also have an appropriately balanced statistical likelihood of being selected. And finally, using zip code data, we have assigned every application to one of 6 regions, which are listed here. And you can see again, after the weighting is applied, each region has the appropriate statistical likelihood of being selected. So with all of these various weighting factors applied, what happens is our huge population here, which has thousands of rows of data, each individual application is given a numeric value for each demographic factor, for gender, for race, for ethnicity, for age, and for region, and ultimately is assigned a number. And those numbers have a very large range. Someone's number could theoretically be very close statistically to 0, or up as high as 150,000, and that's all designed to try and balance the statistical likelihood of selection. Every individual application is then assigned a number, and what the computer will do is select random numbers between 0, the starting point, and the largest number possible based on the number of applications. Once that process is done, those selections, those random numbers, will be divided into the buckets of Democratic, Republican, and unaffiliated, mailing and non-mailing. And then we will take that combined selection of 200 names that were picked at random, and we'll start working through the results tab. Now I'm going to show you how this results tab works. Again, this is sample data. This is not the final selection pool. So in the unlikely event I accidentally get a good draw now, it's not official because not all the applications are in yet. But here's what we're trying to do. When I click this button to do a single test draw, we're actually going to draw as many times as it takes to get the right answer. But I'm going to make a random selection right now, just a single draw. So right now, Excel is going to very quickly run through in the background and make some selections. And when it comes back, it's going to tell us that we have passed the first test of no duplicate records. What happened is when you pick 200 records out of 9,000-ish, we could get 200 unique records, or we could get 198 unique records with 2 duplicates. If we got duplicates, the duplicates only are removed. The 198 unique records stay, and we redraw those 2. If we still have a duplicate, we just redraw the duplicates until we have 200 unique records. So the pass indication here tells me we have 200 unique records. Then we start looking through the individual selections and ask whether or not we met the criteria that were established through consultation with the Department of State on what constitutes mirroring as closely as possible the demographic makeup of the state. So for party, we have selected the appropriate number. There are 30 Democratic mailings, and 30 Democratic non-mailing, 30 Republican mailing, 30 Republican non-mailing, down the list. So we have the exact number of applications. The way the program works, we'll always pass that test. Then we looked at gender. Now, with a completely random selection for gender, we should have had, in theory, to match the census, we should have 98 men and 102 women. What actually happened by random chance was 110 men and 90 women. And the question is does that mirror as closely as possible what we're looking for? And we have determined that being 12 people off is too much. The tolerance that we set for gender is to be within 5%. This is more than that. This is 5.8%. Now, there was a lot of back and forth in the process of deciding what was close enough to say that it mirrors as closely as possible. And while it is theoretically possible to lower these tolerances below the percentages that were selected here, every time we do that, it increases the amount of time that it's probable it'll take to get a proper selection. We could get very, very fortunate and on one draw get something that exactly matches all the categories. But when we modeled it out, the lower the percentages goes, the computer could be trying to make its random selection for multiple days in order to get a proper selection. We're not willing to wait days for a good transparent answer, but we're willing to wait several minutes to make sure we get a good one. And so 5% was both a good basis that we felt was reflective of statistical theory that's used in a variety of contexts, including federal audit sampling. We also felt that just based on balancing out the number of individuals, 5% for gender was going to be close enough. And this particular one fails that test, so we would have to redraw. The next one we look through is for race. And you can see we were targeting 157 white applicants and 28 black applicants. The actual numbers were very close for both of those. We would have said that was within an acceptable tolerance range. We actually did set the tolerance for race a little lower, wanted to make sure we have very good racial diversity, and so 3% is the target. We fell within 3% everywhere, but what happened through this process is there were no American Indian or Alaskan Natives selected. In addition to being within a certain percentage, the application is designed to make sure that no demographic group, no gender, no race, no ethnicity, no region, no age group is unrepresented. So if any of those groups come back with a 0, we consider that a fail and we reselect. So you'll see at the results here at the top, it said we passed on party, we failed on gender, we weren't close enough. And while we were within the percentage for race, we called that 0. And so it was not properly represented. That would be considered a fail and the program would redraw and try again so that no one is left out. For ethnicity, the target for Hispanic applications was 11. We were within one individual of that. It's not perfect, but it's within that close enough, mirroring as closely as possible. So that passed that test. On the age test, we had 23 too many people in the older age category and 16 too few individuals in the lower age category. That's beyond the 5% that we were willing. We're as much as 11.2% too many. And so that failed on the age selection. We would want to redraw to get closer to those. And then here on individual geographic regions, the region that was the furthest off of its demographic target was Southeast Michigan. Wayne County followed behind that. These were all within the 5% threshold. So basically 10 plus or minus individuals is the maximum we would accept for that. We did fall within that range for region, so that would have been a pass. So if I just run another quick single test draw here, we'll get different results. This time we passed on race and failed every other time. One more quick sample. And we passed on gender, we were missing at least one race and failed on ethnicity, age, and region. So that's what the program's going to do. It's going to do it very fast in the background. It's going to pop up a selection counter and tell us how many draws it has taken. I've run tens of thousands of test runs, not with the final data, of course, but with sample data, and I have gotten appropriate results in as few as 2 random selections, which is very unlikely, but it's great when it happens. And we've had to wait 38 minutes, 40 minutes for a selection. I can tell you that statistically, based on the last data I looked at, it is likely that we will have a good hit within about 18 minutes, but it could be more or less. It could be double that. It's just the nature of random. So the bottom line from all of this, the selection is 100% random. but it is recast if it doesn't meet the criteria of mirroring as closely as possible. Anything else you'd want from a summary before we're ready to take the live data?
No, I think that was a fantastic explanation.
All right, then I think I am ready to receive the sealed envelope with the final application database, and we will import that. Gonna go ahead and sign for this.
De-identified data?
Yep, I want the de-identified data, no names. And you can hang on to that until we're ready for it. Thank you. At the end of the process, we will take the identified information and join so that we can see who the actual people selected were, but I won't even have custody of the list of names of who anyone is until the selection has already been finalized. It's even a fancy envelope with Department of State on it. All right, we have a thumb drive in here. Secured thumb drive. Give me a moment to have my computer recognize it. All right, this USB drive contains a single Excel file that is called De-Identified Eligible Notarized, XLS. And just so everyone can kind of see what's in it, I will open the file briefly and then I'll close it and do the import. So it is an Excel file, just like the one we looked at, the sample data that we looked at a moment ago. It's got application ID numbers, which are assigned by the program, the database that keeps track of them. It's got birth year, age, sex, the yes or no questions for the various race categories and ethnicity categories, zip code for determining region, party affiliation, and whether or not they received the mailing. So I'm going to go ahead and close that, and we are now going to import the database. When I click import database, it asks me where the file is saved, and that is on this D drive I just inserted. The program is opening that data and copying and pasting it into my Excel program. It has logged that that was received today on June 24 at 10:22 a.m. and 7 seconds. It has run a series of tests. The green check marks indicate that there were 9,326 records imported, that the number of records for each of the categories is at least the number that we're required to select. Record validation did not find any errors in the data set, so no inconsistent answers. All the zip codes were validated against the U.S. Postal Service's zip code database, and the weighting that was applied to all of the records now has been confirmed that it matches the numbers set by the Census Bureau. So just to quickly look at the application pool that we've got here, in the end, we had total number of Democratic applications was 3,588. Total number of Republican applications was 1,206. And total number of unaffiliated applications was 4,532, collectively 9,326 applications. Looking down the list here, male applications made up 55.5% of the total applications submitted, and female 44.5. After weighting, we have rebalanced for that to give males and females both the appropriate statistical likelihood of being selected. By race, we can see the actual percentages of applications received for white applicants was 79.8, just slightly higher than the 78.5 called for by the census. African American at 13.6, very close to the 13.8. American Indian and Alaskan Natives very close. Asian at 2% compared to 3.1% by census, so they'll have a larger weighting factor to counterbalance that and get them back to the 3.1% likelihood of selection that's in the census data. People who identified as other race at 1.7%, so they'll get a little lower weighting to bring that down to the census percentage of 1.2. And anyone who checked 2 or more boxes, consistent with how the Census Bureau tracks their numbers, was put into this bucket of 2 or more races. And that at 2.6% is very close to the census target as well. So as we've seen over time, the race data has gotten closer and closer to the actual demographics of the state as applications are processed. That's good. Actual percentage of Hispanic ethnicity applications is a little under the census percentage, so those will get additional weighting to balance that out. On age, as we've seen with the test data, the older age band is a little overrepresented. 61% of the applications came from the older band, and only 11.6% came from the younger band. We're closer to balanced there in the middle. You'll notice that the weighting factor that's applied to age is the highest of all of them. Every demographic category is weighted and balanced appropriately, but age has been the hardest one to find selections. When you just pick at random and we're so underrepresented with certain categories, a higher weighting factor helps counterbalance that and give us a statistically valid chance of meeting those criteria. Looks like the final numbers for region came relatively close, a little underrepresented in East Central and a bit overrepresented in Southeast, but fairly close in all the categories. And again, with the weighting applied, everything matched there the way we were looking for. So with those all in, having set tolerances of 5% for gender, age, and region, 3% for race, and we set, I didn't mention this before, but we set the tolerance for Hispanic at 2% because when only 5% of the population is supposed to be Hispanic, if the tolerance was 5%, that would theoretically allow no one to be represented, and that did not feel right at all. So we set that at a much lower percentage, and have none of our test runs have had any difficulty staying within that lower tolerance for that one criteria. And then, as I mentioned, regardless of any of those tolerances that are set, every demographic group has to be represented. So at this point, I'm going to click the button to start drawing samples. The program will log how many attempts, the start time, and it will tell us how long it elapses, which it could be a few minutes or longer. We will see. So here we go. It takes roughly a second per draw. So we're 5 or 6 draws in now. And at this point, we play the waiting game. So if you want to start taking questions, now's the time.
Yeah. So one thing I just, as you were going through that, it reminded me we often have people ask us, will the same criteria be applied to when we do the final selection, so the selection of 13? And the answer to that is, of course, no.
Right.
The Constitution required that the semifinalist pool reflect as closely as possible the demographics of the state of Michigan. But once those 200 folks are selected, the final selection is completely random.
Right. And you may remember from when we did the initial drawing of the 250,000 records from the voter database to send the mailings, we used a different program, not Excel. We actually used an audit software that is designed to do completely statistically random draws and to document that process. We'll switch back to that program both at the end of today to re-identify this list and keep human interaction out of it, and for that final truly random selection.
Yeah, so that's one thing to keep in mind. Let me just check and see if we've gotten any other questions so far. So you also mentioned, in the weighting, the way that the weighting is done. And I think it's interesting that the weighting is really a way of, it doesn't mean that, this group is necessarily more or less likely to be selected, because that's determined by what was put in the Constitution by voters. But the weighting is actually done to ensure that it doesn't take us 4 weeks to get a selection that matches that criteria.
It's very true. When we were running early tests and every demographic category was given equal priority in the process of making selections, what we found is I could make 10,000 random draws, and we might be able to get the right mix of male versus female 20% of the time, which is a respectable percentage. And that's kind of what we targeted. If each category is right between, we'll say on the low end, 17% of the time, high end, 23% of the time, by the time we have to combine all these factors, you keep multiplying percentages by each other, and the chances get smaller and smaller and smaller. So if you had 5 or 6 criteria with a 1 in 6 chance, 17% each time, you're down to like a 1 in 1,000 chance of getting everything hit. Well, when we had everything with equal weighting, I would run 10,000 runs and never once get an appropriate balance on age. And it was because the application pool, while there were absolutely people in there from all three age bands, there weren't nearly enough to give a random selection a good chance at picking the right mix. So by putting more and more emphasis on different areas, we tried through trial and error until we could consistently get 10,000 test runs that gave us a fairly balanced likelihood of each demographic category being met. And what you would see if you look at that is we'd run 10,000 selections and we would get gender right 20% of the time, and we'd get region right 20% of the time, and we'd get ethnicity right 30% of the time, but we'd only get all of the factors right a fraction of a percentage of the time. And that's really what's adding up to the time here. We're 270 draws in now and haven't got a match yet, but it's not to say that none of the criteria, I would guess in every one of these runs, at least one criteria and probably two or three met. We've just got to hit on all of them at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's important because, everybody, obviously, we have over 9,000 applicants.
Mhm.
And they should know that every one of them has a chance to get drawn.
Absolutely.
The waiting is really about making sure that the draw, we only have until the end of the month to conduct this drawing. And so we
True.
needed to do this in a way that made sure that, that the actual draw itself, done randomly, would work out in time for us to deliver it to the legislature.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember, but one of the early things when we were trying different tolerances, we had predicted the likelihood of getting a result would take something like 13 days. Well, we don't have 13 days before this is due, and that was only the average. It could have been more or less. So good to build that in.
Yeah. So we've got a question about just sort of the timeline going forward, and I think specifically folks are always wondering, will the commission's work impact the maps, the district maps for this coming November election? And the answer to that is no. The commission itself, once the 13 members are seated and hold their first meeting, they will then really spend much of the next year holding public meetings across the state and taking public input in order to draw maps for the 2022 federal elections, federal and state elections. The other thing that they'll be waiting on, of course, is the updated census data, because they will want to take that into account. That's required by law, and so that will be part of the process over the next really year and a half. The important thing there is that we have 9,000 applications or applicants today. Only 13 people will end up serving on the commission, but that does not mean in any way that they don't have the opportunity to participate. In fact, what we expect is that over the next period of time, over the next months and through the next year, those people who have been, so excited about this will continue to participate by, they can submit map ideas, they can go to public meetings and ask questions, provide their ideas and insight there. They can talk about, their communities with members of the commission. They can submit, either in writing or in verbal testimony at meetings about, why it's important that their particular community be maintained in these district maps. I think that's really important for Michiganders to know, is that, the goal of this process throughout has been to be driven by the people of Michigan and for it to be transparent. And so those goals will continue even after these 13 people are selected. Let's see what other questions we have. Let's see, will we keep the finalists' complete home addresses private? And so the answer to that is yes. We will not post street addresses on our website. The goal of sharing the applications of the people who are selected, of these 200 semifinalists, is because, again, this is a transparent process, and by shining light and allowing everyone to see who has applied and their applications, that is really a way to make sure that these 200 semifinalists submitted applications in good faith, and did so, with as as honest representation as they could provide, given the constructs of the application itself. So, we hope that people do take a good look at the 200. If they see something that they think is amiss, they should contact their legislator about it. Of course, that's why the legislative leaders are able to strike up to 20 applications. But, actual very detailed, street addresses and things like that, we will not share in order to protect the privacy of these people, while still ensuring that their application information is public and transparent. Let's see. How many applicants were randomly mailed an application, and how many are in the pool? So 250,000 registered voters across the state received an application in the mail. The actual pool of 200 will include 100 people who received that mailing and 100 people who did not. Stephen, I think you had...
Yeah, it's a little over 3,000 people who received mailings are in here. The numbers are actually just visible on the screen right now. Democrats who received a mailing and responded, applications from Democrats who received a mailing was 1,073. Republicans who responded to a mailing was 651. And unaffiliated who had received a mailing was 1,688. So a little over 3,000 there.
Yep. So we also have and you know what, I forgot to mention it earlier, but should have. So Riemann LLC, obviously, Department of State selected your firm through a public bidding process, just the way we would select any other contractor. And I also mispronounced your last name. It's Bland, not Land. My apologies. Thank you for being here today and for helping us so much throughout this process. Next question we got was, why could we force party affiliation proportions, but not the other categories? And the answer to that is because that's what's stated in the Constitution. So when voters passed the amendment to the Constitution that created this process, they were explicit about the fact that the commission would be made up of certain proportions of people reflecting the different parties. And so that was something that we could be very firm about. In this case, 60 folks who affiliate with Democrats, 60 who affiliate with Republicans, and 80 who don't affiliate with either major party. However, on the other categories, the goal was not explicit. I mean, the goal was explicitly stated. We should match as closely as possible the state demographics, but that wasn't provided in actual numbers. And so we've used census data in order to, as closely as possible, make sure that this pool does mirror the demographics of the state.
Indeed. And one common misunderstanding that has come up throughout this process, there's no requirement for the intersection of all the various demographic factors to be met. So, for example, we're not trying to find a particular percentage of female African-American Democrats from a particular region. We need each of those categories to be representative out of the pool of 200, but how they interact with each other is not something we even look at through this process.
Yeah. And the census data, of course, that we used was the 2018 5-year census data. You can actually see there's many more details about that at redistrictingmichigan.org, as well as the full applicant profile that outlines the final applicants. So these 9,300 some applications. I'll also mention the number is above 9,300 in both cases. What's on our website and what we have here in the data set. We did have some people ask for their applications to be withdrawn in the final days, and so that's why you do see two slightly different numbers. But the vast majority of the 9,300 plus folks are in it for the long haul, and looking for their chance to serve on the commission and really make Michigan history, which is great. We got a question about what, yes, perhaps our most commonly asked question, what is the time commitment for commissioners? And it's a great question. It's also a question that we can't answer because it will be up to the commission to determine their work schedule. What we have been telling people who ask this question really throughout the application process is that we expect there will be some weeks when commissioners will work quite a bit and some weeks when they don't work at all. I think it's, or maybe just a few hours. It's, it will ebb and flow depending on the work the commission has on its plate and how they decide to set up their schedules. We expect that we'll have people on the commission who are carrying full-time jobs, and that's totally appropriate. The law requires that their job actually cannot treat them any differently and must allow them to participate in the commission. But it will be up to the commission itself to determine, how they want to flex the work that they're doing, how they want to designate their hours, when and where they want to host their public meetings, in order to make sure that that really does work for those 13 people. Yeah, I think that covers that. So we got the question, why is Wayne County its own region in the way that we sort of split up the different regions of the state? And the answer, there's a couple ways to think about that. So one is there's so many people living in Wayne County that when you're trying to set up balanced proportions of the state by region, Wayne County sort of stands out because it just has such a high population. By making it its own region, you do two things. One is if you were to expand the region to include other counties around it, you would actually reduce the chances of those counties or people in those counties being selected because they would be lumped into this large group that is largely comprised of people in Wayne County. And so in some ways it's more fair to have Wayne County be its own for other counties. Similarly, it's more fair because Wayne County has such a high population count to use that to balance the other population centers around the state. And so, that was really the calculus that went into this was, again, how do we make this as fair as possible? And then how do we be transparent? So the other thing that folks may remember is when this criteria was determined, and I'm forgetting the exact date, but probably a month or two ago, we had a public comment period and there was opportunity for people to ask questions and submit ideas or feedback in terms of suggestions of how we ought to do it differently. And that process, I've just been interrupted. We have a complete selection.
We did. I wasn't going to interrupt you because that's important information, but we did. The computer finished. It took 1,128 attempts to find a good answer. We had 14 minutes and 16 seconds elapsed, and I am ready to export the results.
That's great. Let's do it.
All right. I am going to export these now. This right to the place where we're going to do the actual database combine. So source files, and this is all right, we have exported a list of 200 random ID numbers. So just so you can see what the program just put out, it's a list of ID numbers. That's it. There is no identifying information. There are 200 of them. And now I am ready to receive the sealed envelope with actual identified records so that we can merge this together and provide the information for the department. Thank you very much. Absolutely. So what we have here, it's another first time this thumb drive's been attached, so I'll need to unlock it. But what we have here is the complete database of applications. Other than maybe in the first month or so of its development, I've never received a copy of this, and even then I don't think they'd all been finalized and notarized. So this is new information to me. I'm not going to open it on screen because it does have everybody's name who submitted an application. You'll see a couple of records through the process just because that's how the program works. But it is the complete database. And what I'm going to do is take that export of the 200 application IDs, and we're going to use a piece of software I'll walk you through as I do it that combines the two and gives me the full data for just those 200 people. And that, of course, is something that you do plan to share. So let me first connect to this drive. All right, we have a file called Identified All Notarized Applicants. It's an Excel file dated today, earlier this morning at 9:25 a.m. I'm going to copy that and move it over to this folder. I did have an earlier test version that did not have, it had fake names in it just for testing. I'm deleting that so there's no confusion. We're only working with the file I just exported at 10:43 this morning with 200 application IDs, and this list I just got off this thumb drive with from 9:25 this morning with all of the applications. I'll go ahead and remove that one. The software that I'm using is the same one we did for the initial 250,000 records. It's called Caseware IDEA. It is an industry standard software used by CPA firms in the conduct of audits, and it's designed to read large amounts of data, make random selections, do database joins, that sort of thing. All we're using it for here is to import those two record sets and to combine them to re-identify the application IDs. So I'm going to add in those two files here. I need to add an Excel file, which is my selected applications. The first row is the ID number, and that's importing. So when that finishes coming in, that's just a list of 200 records with ID numbers. Now I'm going to import the actual re-identified application database. It's only going to preview a few lines of information. First row has field names, and as that starts coming in, our total application database there is 9,326 records, just the same as we were using from the de-identified list. Now I'm going to join those two together. So I'm using the database feature called join, which just takes two databases and looks for the overlap between them. And we are going to join those on the field ID number. That is combining the two now, and I now have a table that should be exactly 200 records that are the application IDs that we just selected, and it has the names of those individuals. So I am now going to export this and put it on the empty thumb drive I was given for the results. Export as an Excel file. All these records. And we're going to send that straight to, sorry, all of these thumb drives that you've given me are password protected, and until I unlock it each time, I can't access it. Give me just a moment to do that. All right, this PC, D drive. Normally putting a password on a sticky note's not advisable, but I'm glad you did it because otherwise I wouldn't have known what those were. All right, empty thumb drive. Let's go ahead and export to that now. All right, I'm going to verify that that exported. There is a file created today at 10:49 a.m. fairly small. It's called Join Databases, and that is the results of our 200 records. I will now eject that and provide it to you for your posting.
Thank you. So I've handed the file to Nelson Lawens, technician here with the Michigan Department of State, who's going to upload it immediately to redistrictingmichigan.org in order to make it available to the public.
Join Databases.
There it is.
Third row, third one in.
So there you go. So anyone is now encouraged, in fact, more than welcome, but also encouraged to go visit redistrictingmichigan.org. If you're an applicant, see if your name is on this list of 200, or if you're just an interested party or member of the media, please feel free to look through this list of 200 people and celebrate the fact that our application period is successfully closed and our selection period is up and running. So, Stephen, thank you so much for your help today.
You're very welcome.
And thank you all for tuning in. We will be back in touch after the next step in the process. Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.